So on this warm summer day, we'll continue with the series we've been in called Faith, Let's Get Real. Right? And of course, the whole purpose of this series is to basically look at what it means in practical terms to live as a Jesus follower. Right? But what we're using as kind of our kind of guide through this process is the New Testament book of James. But as we've done in the other weeks, what we'll do is we'll look at what James says, but we'll also take a look at what Jesus says about the topic and a little bit about what Paul says. Because when we kind of look across the three of them and the words we have from each one, it really kind of helps us to see kind of the point that's being made. Now remember that what we call the book of James is really just a letter written to a group of churches that were dealing with a very difficult time. And basically, this letter was something James wrote to just as kind of a collection of wisdom, to just try to kind of help these churches that were going through a difficult time, just to kind of get through what was happening. And the thing that is a little bit challenging about James, I often struggle with preaching on James because James, he uses some tough words, right? He doesn't really pull his punches. He's pretty direct in what he says. Sometimes it's a little challenging, more challenging language than I would generally use. But I think one of the things that's important to understand is that James is trying to get his audience, trying to get us to see something. Because remember that he's talked about these ideas like trials and temptations, and he says when things are hard, you should find joy in that, and that's not really easy to do. But what he wants his audience to see, and what I think he wants us to see, is that he wants us to recognize that our lives can be more. You notice, and the language I use here is that he wants us to be all that you are. Right? It's not the army thing of be all that you can be. I got that right. It's the army. That's the army slogan, right? Be all that you can be. I don't want to offend the wrong military sort of thing, right? Be all that you can be. Basically, another way that I would say this is be all that you already are. And I couldn't make up my mind when I was making these slides that I want this one, which is the Marvel version of the superhero pose, versus this one, which is the DC Comics version of the superhero pose. But thanks to the magic of AI, I could simply make one, and it made the other for me. But here's the thing is that what I wanted us to see, or what I'm hoping that we'll see, and I truly believe this is what James wants his audience to see, that when we go through our lives, we are often striving to find something. That we have a discontent. We have a sense that we want something more. And we keep looking for that more out there somewhere. That if I do this thing, if I consume this thing, if I have this thing, then I'll be okay. And if you've consumed enough, had enough, pursued enough, and you get them, did you feel okay? No, right? What James wants us to see, what I hope we'll see, and it's something that I long struggled to embrace, that when you put your faith in Jesus, Jesus gives you everything you need, that you're filled by that. But if that's true, why, when I put my faith in Jesus, why didn't all of my addictions and problems, why didn't they just all go away? Because they didn't. I still had work to do. Because the journey is learning to recognize that that's what's happened. That the journey of our life is learning to recognize that in Christ you are complete. But to find that, to understand that, there are some things we're going to have to let go of. Because we keep holding on to old thinking, old ways of doing things, old ways of believing we're going to be okay. And we also need to embrace some new things and live differently. And this is what James is calling us towards. But I want to be really clear that this idea that in Christ we have come complete, the Apostle Paul really captures this well for us. I read something Paul wrote from the book of Ephesians earlier. I want to read something else that Paul writes from the book of Colossians, another letter, where he's trying to get the people to understand what it means when we embrace life with Jesus. Paul tells us this, he says, "For in Christ lives all the fullness of God in a human body." I like God in a bod better as a catchphrase, but basically what he's saying is that Jesus was fully human and Jesus was fully God. He was completely God. And so we can embrace that. But he says, but this is what it means for you, that when you put your faith in him, so you also are complete through your union with Christ, who is the head over every ruler and authority. This is where the kind of language, Jesus is the King of Kings. He's over everything else. But what Paul is saying here is just as Jesus was completely God, when we put our faith in Jesus, he makes us completely human. In other words, Jesus is the perfect human. And when we connect with him in our hearts, when we put our faith in him, that he gives us everything we need to live the life that God calls us to. But the journey is learning how to do that. That the answer is already in you, but it's learning to understand it. And as I said, that means stripping away things that hold us back, embracing things that take us forward. And one of the things that's very challenging about when we start reading the book of James is that when James starts, kind of starts out with, consider it joy whenever you're in trial, when everything's hard, you're like, I don't think this guy knows what he's talking about, right? But what he's trying to set up is that even in our difficulties, we're in that journey of becoming, some people use the language purified, right? Of just kind of stripping away the things that in difficult times, we look at what's really important to us, and we hold on to what's most important to us, and we start to see what really matters to us. And so James is on this journey of trying to help us understand how much we have access to in our relationship with Jesus. So kind of launching off from what Paul has told us here, I want to kind of jump into the book of James now. We're going to pick up right where we left off last week, right? So we finished on verse 18 last week, verse 19 this week. James says this. He says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. And what he's saying here is that this is the things that if we're going to live in the fullness of what Jesus invites us into, these are some of the changes that we need to start making. In other words, the way you talk to people matters. The way I talk to people matters. The way I react to situations matters. And what he's trying to do is give us some basic guidance here that if we want to kind of have a better relationship with people, if we want to be more effective in our lives, if we want to do what we can with our lives, he's like, you know what? You need to prioritize listening. Don't wait to talk. Actually listen. Right? To actually take time to hear from someone. Take time to consider your response. Because look, I'm a guy who, I love to talk fast, right? I like to think I think fast. I'm probably wrong about that. But I talk fast, I believe I think fast, and I act fast. And I get angry really fast. A lifelong battle for me is managing my anger. And what James is setting up here is that all of those things really matter. Because he says that what do we need to do? We need to be slow to get angry. So basically, a life living in the fullness of who we are created to be might be found by slowing down a little bit. Taking the time to understand what's happening. Taking the time to think about how you react. In fact, I heard someone once say, stop reacting, start responding. And by way of an example, if you react to your medication, that's not a good thing. But if you respond to your medication, something good is coming out of that. To live a life where we're responding to situations, not reacting to situations. And so he's telling us to slow down. And he's really warning us about this issue about anger. Right? Because as he talks about anger, he goes on to say, human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. And what he's really saying in that is that don't let your emotions control you. Right? What he's really inviting us to do is to be in self-control in our situations. Right? If we slow down, then we're actually thinking and we're responding. But if our emotions start to rise up, those emotions start to take control. And there is no, at least in my life, there is no emotion that takes control like anger. Right, that we are rarely in control when we are really angry. And so he's saying, but slow down, right? Don't let that run you, right? Be slow to get angry. And as he says this, human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires, right? That we're on this path of purification. right? Living more in righteousness. And that has a lot to do with how we interact with one another, how we treat one another, and how we thoughtfully deal with our experiences. You know, and whenever I have this conversation with people about anger, people will very quickly point out something to me about Jesus. What do you think they point out to me? Well, Jesus got angry, and Jesus never sinned. Yeah, let's look at Jesus' anger versus my anger. And I might invite you to look at Jesus' anger versus your anger. Right? If we read through the gospel accounts, there are 3 kinds of situations where Jesus gets angry. Right? One is when religious people choose religious ritual, religious busyness over human need. Right? Jesus directly calls out. He actually says at one point, hey, I'm going to say the church, but he actually said the temple. But he says, look, if you're heading to church and you're actually there to do some religious practice, and you realize someone legitimately has a problem with you, Jesus says, leave church. Go deal with that problem first. Get things right with that person. And then come back. The people and our relationship with people and how we deal with people. So when people put religion above human well-being, that made Jesus angry. Another thing that made him really angry, this is probably one of the most famous ones, when people use religion to take advantage of people, right? Use people's desire for God, people's hope to be right with God. People worry about their lives because we know that in the time that Jesus lived in the first century, the religious leadership was stealing from people all the time. Right? Creating circumstances where people had to spend money they didn't need to spend because that would get you right with God. That made Jesus really angry. That's the one where he flips the tables, right? All those sort of things. And the other one I think is a really important one. He got angry when his followers prevented families from bringing, I always get this wrong. When his followers prevented families from bringing their children to meet Jesus. That they thought that what Jesus was doing was too important. These kids, they couldn't take time with these kids. And Jesus is like, slow down. I want to see the kids. I want to spend time with the kids. See, what makes Jesus angry is when people get in the way of people coming to know God. That's what makes Jesus angry. And, if you're faced with one of those circumstances, you can do something. Maybe that anger is righteous. But for most of us, that's not the anger we experience, right? For most of us, our anger rises up because something is not the way we think it should be, right? They should not have said that to me, or I should have been recognized for doing that, or they shouldn't have talked to me like that, and they need to know. That's where most of our anger comes from. And so what James is saying here is that the anger that we're prone to is not going to be righteous most of the time. I mean, it doesn't mean there aren't things that are wrong in the world. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that shouldn't upset us. I think it's terrible that so many people have trouble accessing food and resources. And it upsets me a lot. But being angry about it's not going to really get me there versus being slow to respond, slow to think, figuring out what we can do to make a difference. Right? It doesn't mean you don't care. It simply means that we don't let our emotions take over. And one of the things that we're kind of heading to in this journey, if you look at kind of stuff we talked about last week with temptation and dealing with our temptation, if you remember that when we talked about temptation last week, we put this thing out that there's nothing wrong with being tempted, right? We all experience temptation. We even know Jesus experienced temptation. The problem is, the challenge is that when we act on it, right? The word we use for that in the Bible is sin, right? But sin simply means anything we do that harms someone else or harms ourselves. If you remember that the focus last week was, hey, you have temptation, that happens. But don't wait until you're on the edge of doing something to deal with it. You capture that temptation right away and you say, hey, this is something I struggle with. I know it's something I struggle with. So I'm going to try to resolve it while I'm still at temptation, long before I get to action. And what's happening here as James kind of lays out this idea of being slow in our words and slow to respond and, slow to get angry. What he's pointing out to us is just like there's a relationship between temptation and harmful action, there's a relationship between our emotions, our words, and our actions. Right? If we can actually keep a check on our emotions, we don't let our anger rise up, we're much less likely to create harmful actions. And if we can keep a check on our words, we are much less likely to have harmful actions. And I think we know that. Right? Imagine something happens in your life and somebody does you wrong in some way. They broke something, they didn't do what you like, whatever it is. If it happens and you don't like it, but you move on, you're like, it's not what I wanted, but I'm okay. You feel one way. But what if you sit and dwell on it for a while? Oh, man, I know. I know. But he did that on purpose, right? And so I start dwelling on it, and my feelings start to change, and they start to rise up. And before long, what am I doing? I'm talking about them to someone else. Oh, he's always like that. Yeah, that's what they're like. And what do your emotions do then? Right now you get this little feedback loop going, right? You got some emotions that turn into words, which pump up the emotion, which turns into more words, which pump up the emotions, which turn into more words. And before long, we are doing things that are harmful, right? We may be mistreating someone. We may be closing them out of things. We may be talking about them, which is harmful, right? Because it damages their reputation. That we know that there is a clear connection between our emotions, our words, and eventually our actions. And so what James is encouraging us to do is to keep all those things in check. And this is actually something that Jesus talks about very specifically and in very direct terms. Because we know from the gospel writer Matthew, at what we call the Sermon on the Mount, right? And the Sermon on the Mount is this kind of very large message that Jesus gives where there are thousands of people there, and he kind of runs through just a wide array of issues about what it really means to kind of live in connection with God. And one of the things he wants to do as part of this is help us understand, like, what is that connection between our words and our emotions and our actions? So Jesus, kind of being ever the kind of, perfect speaker, great speaker, he, instead of starting with kind of emotions and then words and getting to action, he starts out talking about action. And he talks about the most significant action. He actually says this. So this is the words of Jesus. So there are thousands of people listening, and he goes, well, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And what he's doing, of course, is he's talking about the Ten Commandments, which would have been centuries and centuries before the time of Jesus. And what happens when he says this? Everybody starts nodding, yeah, murder's wrong. I can vote for that, right? Murder's wrong. And someone's subject to judgment, yeah. And Jesus has now brought them in. And he's got their attention, because like who's he going to talk about now? And then Jesus goes on to say, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So Jesus is saying that being angry leads to judgment. It is a harmful act. I'm not saying it's the same scale as murder, but it is a harmful act. And then he goes on from there, and this next one's going to really convict you. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable in court. How many of you are running around saying Raka all the time? Nobody. Wow, your Aramaic is not very good at all, I will say. Yeah, the word he's using there, Raka, is, as I said, is Aramaic. It's important to understand that in the first century, what's known as Common Greek, or Koine Greek, it was the primary language of that region in the first century. But also Aramaic was another language that was widely spoken. And the word Raka, there's no direct translation, but kind of like idiot, you're worthless, you're empty-headed, right? So he basically says, you call people names like that. He says you're answerable to the court. What does the court render? Judgment. Calling people names is worthy of judgment. And he goes on to say, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Well, that feels like a lot, right? It's always important to understand that whenever the Bible was not written in English, right? We talk about that all the time, right? This part of the Bible was mostly written in Greek. But the translators have a job to do, right? The translators just can't blindly translate words because we'd have a tough time following the thought because the language structures are very different. So the word that's actually translated as fire, or actually as hell here, where it says fire of hell, what Jesus actually says is in danger of the fire of Gehenna. Gehenna is a valley near where they're at, but it was a notorious valley. It had been a valley that once was associated with human sacrifice, but over the centuries, what it had become was a garbage dump and a waste refuge where people burn their garbage. And it had been going on for so long that the fire never went out. And so it was this constant fire, and there were these deep caverns, and there was kind of this legend that it would go down into the world of the undead. And so what it became associated with was being a place of, what do you think? Judgment. So Jesus says, when you call people names, when you treat them in a belittling way, when you talk poorly about them, Jesus is saying that's also worthy of judgment. And the point that Jesus is building through all of this is to not make us feel condemned. It's to get us to recognize that it's not only outward action that is harmful, right? That when we commit a harmful action, that action did not begin and end with just that action. How did it start? It started with a thought that became an emotion that was likely expressed in words, and then it became an action. And what Jesus is pointing back to is that when that thought comes, don't feed the thought so it becomes an emotion, and then feed the emotion so it becomes words, and then feed the words so they become action. Take hold of it right in the beginning, and don't let it become all those things. And Jesus is going as far to say is that, hurtful words are harmful. Right? So the second that thought pops into our head, just like we were talking about temptation, right? As soon as I know I'm in a situation where I am tempted and I may struggle with that temptation, I should take hold of that, not wait until I'm on the edge of doing something. Here, as soon as that thought comes into my head and I'm heading in a direction of negative emotions and anger and talking about someone and complaining about someone and pointing out someone else's flaws, he said, don't follow that train. When that thought comes to your head, move on. Free up yourself from that sort of thing. Right? And we know that dwelling on anger affects how we feel about people. I mean, and if you start to talk negatively about someone, it starts to change how you feel about that person. And you will eventually start talking to someone else about that person. But there's another place that we need to be careful about that. There's negative thoughts about ourselves. And we start to think negative things about ourselves, and we start to call ourselves names, even if we don't do it out loud. How does it make you feel about yourself? And that drags you down. Right? So the invitation here is to simply say, don't get caught up in that stuff. Right? That we're trying to live in the fullness of what we have in Jesus. So don't, things will come along that are upsetting. Right? And if you want to do something about it, be part of the solution. Be constructive in it. But don't let the emotions take over and take us down that path. Because fundamentally, all these things here, talking bad about people, kind of, holding on to negative emotions about people, kind of pushing people around, all these sort of things that come from just focusing on negativity is ultimately inconsistent with the way Jesus calls us to treat one another. Right? Because how does he call us to treat one another? Right? Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Loving people like Jesus loves us. What did Jesus do? He gave up everything to give us life and connection to God. And so he says, this is the standard I want you to follow, knowing we can never fully live up to it. But it's something to pursue. And the more that we try to do that, the more we are changed, the more we are transformed. I mean, if you've ever known anyone who actually kind of gets pretty far on that and really just doesn't get, upset by things, not that they're checked out, not that they're not engaged, they just don't get spun up. Those people stand out. and they make a big difference in life. And they calm the rest of us down. Jesus is saying, be those people. Because honestly, if you're treating someone poorly, that's not loving. Or if you're calling someone names, that's not loving. If you're giving someone the cold shoulder or pushing them out, that's not loving. Because this brings us back to this idea that we want to live in the fullness of Christ, the fullness, the completeness that we receive through Jesus. Right? So in that, we need to recognize that, first of all, believe that when you put your faith in Jesus, that you were made complete. That Jesus gave you everything you needed. And the journey of life is learning to accept that and understand it and see what it means. And then as we do that, live consistent with that. Right? Do we receive salvation by grace by simply putting our faith in Jesus, that he is who he says he is. But then we are called to live out a life that follows that path. And that helps us to become spiritually mature and more aware of that relationship. And so looking at the last thing that James says, or last thing we're going to look at today that James says, this is what James tries to show us now. As he's kind of talked about all these things about temptation and trials that we've talked about the last few weeks, talking about our words and our emotions, James says this. He says, so get rid of all filth and evil in your lives and humbly accept the word God has planted in your hearts, for he has the power to save your souls. He says, strip away the things that prevent you from experiencing that fullness. You are complete. Tear those things away that are holding you back from that, and embrace the things that are part of living that way. And the way that James actually says this, it doesn't come through in English, but it's super cool. Where he says, get rid of. The Greek word that gets translated as get rid of there, it's actually a word that's usually associated with clothing. So like throw off your clothing. It's not pillow talk, by the way, right? But he's basically saying throw off your clothing, right? Throw off the things that hold you back. And what's he talking about? Well, he's basically saying, he's like, think like an athlete. Think like someone who's in this game to win it. Right? Because remember that, and we don't often think about this, right? But in the Greco-Roman world, in that time frame, sports was a huge deal. And one of the most important sports were track runners. Right? And track runners wanted to run as fast as possible. And the feeling at that time was clothing slowed you down. So someone who entered a race to win it would throw off all the clothing. Like literally, they ran naked. It might have been interesting to watch, but they literally did run naked. Because they believed that anything else that they wore made them slower. And so James is saying, what are the things that you're wearing that are slowing you down? What are things that you're holding on to that are keeping you from living in the fullness of Christ? And one of the ways I look at this, kind of staying with my superhero theme for this talk, is that think about Superman and Clark Kent. Right? Superman, he goes around as Clark Kent. He wears a hat. He wears glasses. He wears a suit. He wears a tie. But when he does the Superman thing, what does he do? Gone, right? Because all that stuff slows down the Superman thing, right? Be Superman or Superwoman, super person, whatever it is works for you, right? But throw off those things that are holding you back. Because we want to understand that we are made complete. And in fact, where James says here, humbly accept the word God has planted in your hearts. Right? Not will plant in your hearts, has planted. What he's saying to his audience is, I know you've already accepted Jesus. Right? He's not trying to convince them to be saved. He says, I know you've done that, but you're not living consistent with it. So embrace that, accept it, believe that it's there, and pursue it. Because as Paul told us earlier, right, you are complete through your union with Christ. You already have everything you need to live the life that Jesus is calling you to. Right? You were called for a purpose. If you've put your faith in Jesus, you were called for a purpose. God is calling you to do something. You have every single thing you need. The journey is letting go of and putting down all the things that keep you from experiencing that and embracing the things that are part of experiencing that. And the next time, we'll actually talk more about this kind of embracing things. But the thing we're focused on here is like, what are the things we're holding on to? What is that old thinking? What are those things that we're doing that are keeping us from living in the fullness of God? Right? The power of God dwells in you. Believe that, trust it, and pursue it with your life.